Chapter 5. The Things We Still Believe. Sometime deep in the night, though it might have been early morning, I woke to the quiet rhythm of water against the raft. It had become a kind of heartbeat, soft waves brushing the drums beneath us, the low creak of wood and steel shifting together, the distant murmur of wind moving across open water. For a while I just lay there, half asleep, listening. Then I heard it, a light tapping at my door. At first I thought I had imagined it. Then it came again, soft, careful. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim grey light filtering through the small window. The storm had eased, and a pale glow from the cloud-covered moon slipped through the glass, just enough to see by. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crossed the room. When I opened the door, I stopped. Megan stood there. She had wrapped herself in a simple robe, the fabric pulled close around her, her hair loose over her shoulders. In the low light she looked different than she had during the day, quieter somehow, but also more certain. For a moment neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to wake you." "It's all right," I replied. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated. Then she stepped just inside the doorway, closing the door gently behind her. For a long moment she didn't look at me. Instead she glanced toward the small window, where the faint moonlight cast a pale glow across the room. "When the world ended," she said quietly, "I thought people would come together more." Her voice wasn't sad exactly, just thoughtful. But that's not what I've seen. She folded her arms lightly, as if holding herself steady. "I've seen people afraid, angry, alone, even when they're surrounded by others." She finally looked up at me. "And I understand it. I do. Everything's been taken from us." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Families lost, homes gone, whole towns just erased." She shook her head slowly. "But something else is being lost too." I didn't interrupt. "There used to be this idea," she said, "that the future was something you could count on, that there would always be more people, more life, more chances." She stepped a little closer. "Out here, that's not guaranteed anymore." The raft shifted gently beneath us. The sound of water filled the silence between her words. "My father talks about survival all the time," she continued. "Food, shelter, defense." A faint smile touched her lips. "He's right, of course." Then it faded. "But survival isn't enough." She met my eyes again, steady now. "If people stop building families, if we stop bringing new life into the world," she let the thought hang there, "then it doesn't matter how long we survive." Her voice softened. "Because eventually we'll just fade away." I felt something tighten in my chest hearing her say it. Not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't. She took a slow breath. "I've been thinking about it for a long time," she said, "watching people, watching how things are changing." Her tone shifted then, older somehow than she looked. "Love, it's becoming rare out here. Not gone, but harder. People don't trust easily anymore." She gave a small, almost sad smile. "And I think that's something we can't afford to lose." She stepped just a little closer. "There's an old saying," she said quietly, "it takes a village to raise a child." She glanced toward the direction of the main house where our families slept. "I have that village." Then she looked back at me. "What I don't have is the child." She held my gaze, calm and unflinching, "and I'd like your help with that." The words settled into the room, heavy and real. For a moment, the only sound was the water against the raft. Then she loosened her grip on the robe slightly, not in a careless way, but in a gesture that made her meaning clear. The pale light from the window traced her silhouette, soft and still, and for a second I just stood there. Because I understood what she was offering. Not recklessness, not desperation, something deliberate, something she believed in. I bent down slowly and picked up the edge of the robe where it had slipped. Then I stepped forward and gently held it back around her shoulders. "Thank you," I said quietly. She looked surprised, not hurt, just not expecting that answer. "I mean that," I added. "What you said about the future, about people, you're not wrong." I took a breath. "I've seen the same things you have." I met her eyes. "But I still believe in something else too." She didn't move. "I believe in love," I said. The word felt strange and important at the same time, and not just the kind that helps people survive. I shook my head slightly. The kind that makes life worth building again. The raft shifted gently beneath us. "I won't pretend I'm not tempted," I admitted honestly. "Anyone would be. A small smile touched her lips at that. "But if we're going to bring a child into this world," I tightened my grip on the robe just slightly, making sure it stayed around her, "it has to mean something more than survival." She searched my face, trying to understand. "We do this the old-fashioned way," I said softly. There was a quiet moment between us. Then something in her expression changed. Not disappointment, something closer to respect. She pulled the robe closed again, holding it in place. "All right," she said. Simple, certain. Then she smiled, just a little. "I figured you might say something like that." I let out a small breath. "Good," I said, "because I meant it." She nodded. "I know." For a moment longer we just stood there, the quiet of the drifting world surrounding us. Then she turned toward the door. "Good night, Don." "Good night, Megan." She slipped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. I stood there for a while after she left, listening to the water again. But it didn't sound quite the same anymore, because somewhere in the middle of a drowned world we had just drawn a line between surviving and living. Morning came gently. For once, the rain had eased to little more than a drifting mist, and the light filtering through the glass roof carried a soft grey warmth instead of the usual heavy gloom. The raft creaked and shifted beneath us, but the water had calmed, rolling in long, slow swells. Inside the house, the air was rich with something we hadn't smelled in a long time. Fresh coffee. Mother stood at the stove, carefully pouring steaming water through a proper measure of grounds. Not the reused, stretched-out version we'd grown used to over the past months, but a real pot. Strong, dark, honest. The smell alone lifted everyone's spirits. Emily moved between the pantry and the table, gathering what she could, eggs, a few preserved vegetables, some of the last decent potatoes we had stored away. She worked with quiet excitement, knowing this wasn't just another meal. It was a gathering. I took my seat at the table just as Mother set the pot down. "Help yourselves," she said with a small smile. Father poured first, lifting the cup to his nose and breathing in deeply before taking a sip. "Now that," he said, "is worth getting out of bed for." We had just begun passing plates around when a familiar voice carried across the water. "Raft ahoy!" Father looked up immediately. "That'd be Max," he said, already rising from his chair. We stepped out onto the porch together. Below us, tied neatly alongside our raft, floated a large inflatable military life raft. It rode low in the water under the weight of its cargo, crates, sacks, bundled supplies stacked carefully within it. Captain Max Sutherly stood at the front, one hand gripping a rope line. Beside him was Ruth, steady and composed as always. Tom Bishop sat near the rear, and with them was a man I hadn't seen before. "Morning, John," the captain called up with a grin. "We brought the ham and a can of coffee if you've got eggs and potatoes for a proper breakfast." Father broke into a wide smile. "Well then," he called back, "come and welcome all of you." They climbed aboard one by one, boots thudding softly against the deck. Up close, the new man looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, lean, sharp-eyed, with the kind of hands that had built things for most of their life. The captain clapped him on the shoulder. "John, everyone, this here is Mark Mosby." The man nodded politely. "Pleasure." The captain continued. "Mark's our structural engineer and our gadget man when things start breaking." Mark gave a small, modest smile. "I hear you've got an acetylene torch," he said, looking directly at Father. Father nodded. "We do." Mark crossed his arms thoughtfully. "But no forge." Father shook his head. "No." Mark gave a small nod, as if confirming something in his own mind. "That'll come in handy sooner than you think," he said. "Once your fuel runs out, you'll want another way to work metal." Inside, Mother and Ruth had already begun working together like they'd known each other for years. The ham was unwrapped and sliced thick, the smell of it filling the house as it hit the hot pan. Eggs cracked and sizzled. Potatoes were chopped and tossed into a second skillet. Emily moved quickly between them, gathering fresh eggs, laying out vegetables, even finding a few small preserved fruits to round out the meal. The house filled with warmth. Real warmth. The kind that came from people working together. It was then that Megan appeared. She stepped slowly into the kitchen, still wrapped in her robe, her hair loose and slightly tangled from sleep. She looked like she hadn't fully woken up yet, moving with that quiet, half-dreaming ease. As she passed Father, she rested a hand on his shoulder and kissed the top of his head without a word. Then she walked past me, lightly running her fingers through my hair in a way that caught me completely off guard. I didn't react, not outwardly, but I noticed. She moved on and dropped into a chair beside Tom, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "Good morning, everyone," she said softly. Father looked at her with mild concern. "Did you sleep all right, Megan?" Tom let out a laugh before she could answer. "She always looks like that, John, till she's had her coffee." Megan reached over and smacked his arm lightly. "I do not." Then she took a cup, poured herself some coffee and took a long sip. Her shoulders relaxed almost instantly. "All right," she admitted. "Maybe a little." That earned a few quiet laughs around the table. Then she looked around the room, taking it all in. "I slept beautifully," she said, "and in a real bed." She glanced at her father with a grin. "Beats Navy cots any day." Tom nodded. Hard to argue with that. The food was laid out soon after. Plates filled quickly, eggs, fried potatoes, thick slices of ham, bits of fruit. Coffee cups were topped off again and again. For a little while no one spoke much. People just ate, enjoyed, lived. It was Tom who finally broke the quiet. "I thought we'd take a look at Raft this morning, Mary Ellen," he said between bites. "After this fine feast you've put together." Mother nodded calmly. "Of course." She continued serving without missing a beat, but I could see her mind was already shifting, thinking ahead, preparing. Then the captain set his fork down and leaned back slightly. "And while Mary Ellen's having a look at the boy," he said, "I thought I'd leave Mark here with you." He gestured toward the engineer. "Put him to work building you that forge." Father looked up, surprised. "A gift," the captain added, "from our raft to yours, for the hospitality yesterday." For a moment, Father didn't speak. Then he stood and reached across the table, offering his hand. "Well, thank you, Max." They shook firmly. "We humbly accept." Around the table, smiles spread quietly from one person to the next. Outside, the water rolled gently beneath the raft. Inside, for just a little while longer, the world felt steady again. Father didn't waste time once breakfast was done. Neither did anyone else. The big inflatable dinghy rocked gently against the side of the raft as we climbed down into it, hands already reaching for crates and bundles. The morning had that rare, steady calm to it. No heavy rain, just a low mist drifting across the water and the soft creak of the raft shifting beneath our feet. Mark moved with quiet efficiency, already sorting through what needed to come off first. "Careful with that crate," he said, guiding me as we lifted a box of tools onto the deck. "Weight distribution matters more than people think on something like this," Father nodded. "We've learned that the hard way once or twice." Together we unloaded their supplies, metal parts, sacks of materials, a few pieces of equipment that would soon become something far more valuable once Mark got his hands on them. Then we began loading the dinghy again. Our gifts. Father handed up jars one at a time, preserves, thick and dark, carefully sealed. Emily brought out a small crate of jelly, each jar wrapped in cloth to keep them from breaking. I wrestled a small lawnmower engine across the deck with Mark's help, setting it down gently among the supplies. A few cans of gasoline followed. Not many, but enough. "They'll get more use out of that than we will," Father said quietly. I nodded. Out here, everything had a purpose. Better it be used than saved too long. Once the exchange was finished, Captain Sutherly stepped down into the dinghy, followed by Ruth and Tom. Mother came last, pausing only long enough for Father to take her hand. "We won't be long," she said. Father smiled, but there was a weight behind it. "Take all the time you need." Tom settled himself near the motor and looked up with a grin. "We'll inseminate those cows when I get back," he called. Father gave a short nod. "Looking forward to it." Then Father leaned in and kissed Mother gently. "Be careful," he said. "Always am." The motor sputtered to life and the dinghy eased away from our raft, turning slowly toward the captain's floating city. We stood watching until they were halfway across the water. Then Megan's hand slipped around my arm. She had a surprisingly firm grip. "Mr. Walton," she said sweetly, "would you mind if I stole your son for a walk?" Father didn't even turn. He just chuckled. "Go on then." Emily, who was already hauling a heavy bag of cement toward the tool shed, shot us a look. "Leaving all the work to us, are you?" Mark laughed as he grabbed the handles of a wheelbarrow already loaded with bricks. "I was just starting to like you, Don." Emily adjusted the weight on her shoulder, her guitar bouncing lightly against her back. I hope you two enjoy yourselves, she added, just a little too sweetly. I gave her a grin. I cannot refuse a lady's request, sister. She rolled her eyes. Of course you can't. Father, Mark and Emily headed off toward the tool shed, already discussing where the forge should go. The sound of work followed them almost immediately. Metal clinking, wood shifting, the scrape of tools being pulled from their places. Life continuing, building continuing. Megan and I walked the opposite direction, out along the edge of the deck where the railing opened to the endless water. For a while, neither of us spoke. The raft moved gently beneath our feet, and the only sounds were the distant rhythm of work from the shed and the soft hush of water brushing against the drums below. Megan finally broke the silence. You meant what you said last night. It wasn't a question, I nodded. Yeah. She looked out across the water. I thought so. A light breeze moved through her hair, pulling a few strands loose across her face. She didn't bother brushing them away. You surprised me, she said after a moment. How? She glanced at me, a small smile forming. Most people out here don't say no to things like that. I shrugged slightly. Most people out here aren't thinking long term. She laughed quietly. Fair point. We walked a little farther. Behind us a hammer struck metal, sharp, steady. Mark had clearly found something to work with already. Megan leaned lightly against the railing. Where I come from, she said, before all this people talked about love like it was optional. She traced her fingers along the wood rail. Something you fit into your life if you had time for it. I leaned beside her. And now? She looked out at the horizon. Now it feels like one of the only things that actually matters. The water stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the distant shape of her people's raft. You still believe in it, she said, glancing back at me. Yeah. No conditions? I thought about that. Conditions, I said slowly, aren't the same as doubt. She tilted her head. Explain. I smiled a little. I think love means more when you choose it, I said, when it's not just convenient. She studied me for a moment. You're serious about it? Yeah. She nodded slowly. That's rare now. The hammering from the shed grew louder for a moment, followed by Emily's voice calling something we couldn't quite make out. Megan smiled faintly at the sound. You've got something good here, she said. Your family. I know. She looked at me again, more directly this time. And you're not wrong. About what? Doing things the old-fashioned way. There was a quiet honesty in her voice now. Not challenging, not teasing, just real. I've seen what happens when people stop believing in anything beyond survival, she said. It doesn't end well. I nodded. I've seen it too. She leaned a little closer, not touching, just close enough that I could feel the warmth of her beside me. So, she said lightly, what does the old-fashioned way look like to you? I smiled. Well, I figure it starts with a walk. She laughed softly. Good start. We stood there together for a moment longer, watching the water and listening to the sounds of life being built behind us. The ring of hammer on metal, the scrape of stone, Emily's voice drifting through it all, and somewhere in the middle of it, something new beginning. Across the water, tied fast to the twin hulls of the floating settlement they called Survivor City, Mother stepped from the dinghy onto steel instead of wood. The difference was immediate. Our raft creaked and breathed like something alive. This place felt solid, heavy, built. Men and women moved along the decks above, pausing to watch as Captain Sutherly led the way. Word had clearly spread. People gathered quietly, curious but respectful, keeping their distance as the small group passed. Tom walked beside Mother, hands in his jacket pockets, while Ruth followed just behind them, offering the occasional reassuring smile. Mind your step here, the captain said, guiding them down a narrow stairwell between the two hulls. The air changed as they descended. Cooler, darker. The smell shifted too, from open water and rain to oil, metal, and something faintly medicinal. This was the Coast Guard cutter, the captain explained over his shoulder. We kept most of the interior as it was. They stepped through a watertight door and into a corridor lined with steel walls. Some things had been stripped out, others remained exactly as they had been before the world changed. There's still power in parts of the ship, Tom said. Not steady, but enough to run certain equipment now and then. He tapped the wall lightly. Old systems, built tougher than anything they make now. They passed small rooms. Sleeping quarters turned into shared bunks, storage areas stacked with supplies, even a galley that still held the bones of its former life. Finally, they reached the medical bay. Tom pushed the door open. Inside, the room was cramped but organized. Cabinets lined the walls, some hanging open to reveal neatly stacked supplies. A narrow examination table sat bolted to the floor, and beyond it, separated by a partial divider, was what could generously be called a small operating space. And in the far corner, a bed. Ralph lay there, half asleep. He stirred as they entered, blinking slowly as his eyes adjusted to the light. "Ralph," Tom said gently, stepping forward, "we've got someone for you to meet." The boy turned his head with effort. He couldn't have been much older than me. Pale, thin, but alert. "Mary Ellen," Tom said, gesturing. "This is Ralph." Ralph gave a faint smile and raised a hand, his movements slow but deliberate. Mother stepped forward and took it gently. "Hello, Ralph," she said warmly. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice rough but steady. He tried to sit up. Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. "Easy now." Ralph relaxed back into the bed. "I hear you're the real doctor," he said with a weak grin. Mother smiled slightly. "I hear you're the patient giving everyone trouble." That earned a soft chuckle from him. "Wouldn't be me if I didn't." The tension in the room eased. But for a few minutes, they talked. Simple things. Where he was from, how long he'd been with the crew, a little humour, a little lightness, enough to remind everyone that he was still very much alive. Then Mother's tone shifted, gentle but focused. "Let's have a look," she said. Tom nodded and moved to help. Carefully they turned Ralph onto his stomach. He winced slightly but didn't complain. The space around the bed was tight, very tight. There was barely room for Tom on one side, Mother on the other, and the captain standing just behind them, watching silently. Ralph's shirt had already been cut away. The wound was clean, cleaner than Mother had expected. Tom had done good work. "Entry wounds here," Tom said quietly, pointing. Mother leaned closer. The skin was healing, but just beneath it, there, a faint distortion, a subtle swelling under the surface near the spine, the bullet, barely visible. Too close. Mother's expression grew serious. "How long ago?" she asked. "About 2 weeks," Tom replied. "No signs of infection," she noted. "I've been careful," Tom said. "Daily cleaning, alcohol, fresh dressings." Mother nodded. "You've done well." Tom exhaled slightly at that. She examined the area more closely, her fingers gentle but precise. Ralph remained still, trusting. "The position is dangerous," she said quietly. "Very close to the spine." Tom nodded. "I know." She looked at him. "What have you got for equipment?" Tom straightened slightly, shifting into practical mode. "X-ray's dead," he said. "Tried everything. No response." He gestured toward a corner where an old machine sits dark and useless. "But the defibrillator works," he added. "Tested it last week." Mother nodded. "Good. Anesthesia gas still works too," Tom continued. "Limited supply, but enough for one operation." He moved to a cabinet and opened it. "The autoclave's out," he said. "No pressure, no heat." He paused. "But," he pulled out a sealed pack. "We've still got sterile instruments, factory sealed, enough to do the job." Mother took one, inspecting it. Still intact, still usable. "Plenty of needles," Tom added. "Bandages, sutures," he gave a small half-smile, "and enough alcohol to clean the whole ship twice over." Mother allowed herself a small nod. Good. She stepped back slightly, taking in the entire space, the room, the layout, the limitations. It was tight, cramped, barely enough room to work. One patient, 2 people standing, and that was it. "If we do this," she said slowly, "he'll need to be positioned on his stomach, legs supported to reduce strain on the spine." Tom nodded immediately. "We can brace them against the wall." He gestured to the far side of the room. "Done it before for other procedures." Mother considered that. It would work. Not ideal, but workable. She looked down at Ralph again. He was watching her, calm, waiting. "You understand the risk?" she asked him gently. Ralph gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she straightened. "I'll do it." The words settled into the room like a quiet promise. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The captain's shoulders eased slightly. Ralph smiled. Not a big smile, but a real one. "When?" Tom asked. Mother glanced once more at the space, already planning, already organizing the steps in her mind. "Tomorrow," she said. "Give him 1 more day to build strength." She met Tom's eyes. "And we prepare properly." Tom nodded. "Together." Outside the hull, the water moved softly against the steel. Inside, in that small, crowded room, Mother stood quietly for a moment after making her decision, her eyes moving once more across the small medical bay, every surface, every cabinet, every limitation. Then she turned to Tom. "Tom," she said calmly, "go and do what you promised my husband." Tom blinked. "The cows?" Mother gave a small nod. "And let John know I'll be staying here tonight." The captain raised an eyebrow slightly at that, but said nothing. "I want to keep an eye on Ralph," she continued, already shifting into the steady, focused rhythm that came over her when work truly began. "And I need time to get familiar with this space, every inch of it." She rested a hand lightly on the edge of the instrument table. "If I'm going to operate here, I need to understand exactly what I have to work with." Tom nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Mother looked back at Ralph, her voice softening just a touch. "We'll take good care of you." Ralph gave a small, tired smile. "I believe that." Tom stepped back toward the door, then paused. "I'll be back in a few hours," he said. "Mary Ellen, you make yourself at home." He gave a small half smile. "You've got a whole crew out there eager to meet you." Ruth chuckled lightly. "And don't let Bert scare you off dinner," she added. "He's not the best cook." Tom snorted. "But he's the only one we've got," he finished with a grin. That earned a small laugh from Mother. "I'll take my chances." With that, Tom turned and headed out into the corridor, his boots echoing softly against the steel floor. Back on the deck, the air felt brighter after the dimness of the lower hull. The mist had lifted a little, and the water stretched out in dull silver under the morning sky. Tom moved with purpose. He gathered what he needed quickly, his hands practiced and efficient. From a secured storage locker, he pulled a small insulated cooler and checked its contents carefully. Sealed containers packed in dry ice, each one labelled in neat handwriting. He nodded to himself. Good. Next came a bundle of tools. Simple, practical items wrapped in cloth and tied tight to keep them dry. Then, from the side pocket of his jacket, he pulled something that made one of the nearby crew members laugh. A small rubber duck. Bright yellow, worn from use. Tom gave it a squeeze. It let out a sharp, cheerful squeak that seemed completely out of place in a world like this. "Don't ask," he muttered with a grin, tucking it into the cooler. Tradition. Within minutes the dinghy was loaded. Tom untied the line, checked the small motor and climbed in. "Back shortly," he called up to the captain. Captain Sutherly gave him a nod from the upper deck. "Don't fall in." Tom smirked. "No promises." The motor sputtered to life, then steadied into a low hum as the dinghy pulled away from Survivor City and turned toward our raft. The cooler sat secure at his feet. The future of 2 dairy cows and maybe a few calves packed carefully inside. Along with it, something else travelled across the water. Connection, trade, trust. The kind of quiet agreements that kept people alive now. Behind him, the floating city carried on, people moving, working, preparing. Below deck, in a small steel room, Mother had already begun reorganizing instruments, checking supplies and planning every step of the surgery to come. Ahead of him, our raft waits, and with it, another kind of life being built. Hope had just been given a shape. Chapter 6. Small Trades, Quiet Promises. The low hum of the motor reached us before the dinghy came into view. It drifted through the morning air, steady, familiar, cutting across the softer sounds of work coming from the tool shed. The ring of hammer on metal paused for a moment, as if even that sound had turned to listen. Then Tom came into sight. The inflatable dinghy rode low in the water, loaded but balanced, its wake spreading in gentle ripples behind it. He guided it in with practiced ease, easing off the throttle as he drew alongside the raft. George was already there waiting. No one had called him. He had simply appeared, massive and patient, standing near the edge of the deck with his tail moving in slow, hopeful arcs. Tom chuckled as he tied off the line. "Well now," he said, climbing up onto the deck, "I haven't forgotten you, old boy." George stepped forward immediately. Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 familiar shapes, dog biscuits. He held them up like prized treasure. "Still got a few left," he said. He took a bite from one, more out of habit than hunger, and made a face as he chewed. "Never did understand how I got hooked on these things." George didn't care about that. His eyes stayed fixed on the biscuit. Tom handed him the whole second one. George took it gently, then crunched it down in one satisfied bite. Tom laughed and gave him the rest of the one he had been chewing. "And there you go." He reached back into the dinghy and pulled out a small box. "I brought you the rest of the stash too," he said, setting it down on the deck. "Time I gave up this habit anyway." George wagged his tail like he had just inherited a fortune. By then, Megan and I had made our way back from the far side of the raft. She spotted the dinghy first. "Daddy!" Her pace quickened, her earlier calm replaced with something brighter, more immediate. Tom looked up and smiled. "Morning, sweetheart." She stepped right up to him. "Is Mary Ellen going to do the surgery?" Tom nodded. "Tomorrow." He rested one hand on the side of the dinghy. "She wants to spend the night aboard, observe Ralph, get a proper feel for the space before she goes in." Megan's expression softened slightly. "She'll do it right then." Tom gave a small nod. "She will." There was a brief pause. Then Megan asked, quieter this time, "Does that mean you're staying here?" Tom shook his head. "No, sweetheart. I've got to head back. Mary Ellen will need help preparing." He gestured toward the supplies in the dinghy. "I'm just here to handle the cows, pick you up, grab Mark, and take those fertilized eggs back with us." Megan perked up again at that. "I've got 8 ready to go," she said quickly. "Properly selected." She folded her arms slightly, just a hint of pride in her posture. "You'll have to wait on the rest." Tom raised an eyebrow. "8's a good start." "I'll check again before we leave," she added. "Of course you will," Tom said with a grin. Behind us, the steady sounds of work picked up again. Metal rang against metal. Wood shifted. Mark's voice carried faintly from the shed, followed by Emily's, something about spacing and airflow. Tom tilted his head, listening. "Sounds like you've got yourselves a proper project going." I nodded. "Forge," Tom smiled. "Now that is going to change things for you." He stepped past us, glancing toward the animal pens. "Well then," he said, rolling up his sleeves slightly, "let's go see about those cows." George, having finished his biscuits, immediately fell in beside him. Tom looked down at the big dog. "You coming along, are you?" George wagged his tail. Tom chuckled. "Good. Every operation needs a supervisor." Megan fell into step beside her father, and I followed just behind them. The barn door creaked open, letting out the warm, familiar scent of hay and livestock. Inside, Maggie and Ruth shifted calmly in their stall, unaware of the importance of the morning. Tom paused for a moment, studying them with a practiced eye. "Well now," he said quietly, "let's see if we can make you two the start of something new." Outside, the raft drifted gently. Inside, life continued its quiet, stubborn work, growing, building, and beginning again. We carried everything down to the animal pens together. The barn felt warm compared to the open air outside, the scent of hay, feed, and livestock wrapping around us the moment we stepped in. Maggie and Ruth shifted in their stalls, slow and calm, their large eyes watching us with quiet curiosity. Tom moved like he belonged there. Not hurried, not unsure, just steady. "All right," he said, setting his things down on a nearby workbench. "Let's do this proper." He turned to me. "Don, I need a pot of seawater. Big one if you've got it. Lobster pot, pasta pot, anything like that." I nodded and headed out. The air felt cooler again as I crossed the deck, grabbed one of our larger pots, and filled it from one of the intake barrels. By the time I got back, Tom had already laid out most of what he needed. Megan stood beside him, and in his hand, that rubber duck. He held it out to her. "You hold the duck, Megan." She took it without hesitation. "Now," he said, looking at her seriously, "you remember what to do?" She nodded once. "I remember." I stepped in and handed Tom the pot. "Perfect," he said, taking it from me. He set it on a small Coleman stove he'd already lit, the flame turned low, barely more than a flicker. "And now," he said, adjusting it carefully, "we wait." He moved over to Ruth and began brushing her slowly, calmly, like this was just another morning chore. I glanced at Megan, then at the duck in her hand. "What's the duck for?" She laughed immediately. "You'll see." Then, seeing my expression, she gave in. "It's to keep Daddy from getting kicked." I blinked. "What?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Cows aren't like horses or goats," she explained. "They don't just kick out of nowhere." She nodded toward Ruth. "They always look back first." I frowned, trying to picture it. So, she continued, holding up the duck, "if she starts to turn her head like she's about to line him up, I squeeze this right in her face." She gave it a quick squeeze. Squeak, even I flinched a little. Megan grinned. "Distracts her." She shrugged. "Cows are kind of simple. Once they lose focus, they forget what they were about to do. Tom, still brushing Ruth, spoke without turning. You don't listen to her, Ruth. He gave the cow a gentle pat. You're a good girl, and a pretty one at that. Ruth flicked an ear, unconcerned. Ah, I said slowly, nodding. All right. Then I pointed at the pot. And the warm seawater? Megan didn't even try to hide her smile this time. How would you like something that's been packed in dry ice shoved inside you? I paused. Fair enough. That got a laugh out of all three of us, even Tom. Exactly, he said. The pot began to warm slowly, a faint steam rising from the surface. Tom reached into his supplies and pulled out a long plastic glove, longer than anything I'd ever seen. He tore open the package and slid it on, unrolling it all the way up to his shoulder in one smooth motion. Never rush this part, he said calmly, more to the air than anyone in particular. Then he moved to the cooler. When he opened it, a thick white vapour spilled out, rolling over the edges like fog and drifting down to the floor. Cold, sharp. Inside were several sealed containers, nestled in dry ice. Tom reached in carefully and pulled out what looked at first glance like long, narrow tubes, almost like cake decorators. He held up 4 of them. Straws, he said. He placed them gently into the warming pot. Then he pulled a small thermometer from his pocket and set it into the water. The semen has to be at a precise temperature, he said, glancing between the pot and the thermometer. Too cold, it won't take. Too warm. He shook his head. Same result. We stood there quietly for a moment, waiting. The barn settled into a rhythm around us, the soft shifting of the cows, the low hum of the stove, the distant clang of hammer on metal from the shed, life moving forward in 100 small ways at once. Tom rested one hand lightly on Ruth's back, still calm, still patient. So, he said after a moment, glancing at me, first time seeing something like this? I nodded. Yeah, he smiled faintly. Well, you're about to learn something useful. Megan squeezed the duck once more absent-mindedly. Squeak. Ruth flicked an ear again, and Tom watched the thermometer. Not yet, he murmured, but soon. The barn had settled into a quiet rhythm. Heat from the small stove, the soft shifting of the cows, the faint hiss of warming water, when the door creaked open again. Light spilled in from outside. Emily stepped through first, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, her guitar still slung across her back. Behind her came Father and Mark, both dusted lightly with grey powder and flecks of grit from their work. Mark wiped his hands on a rag, leaving pale streaks across his sleeves. Well, he said, glancing around, we've got the beginnings of something. Father nodded toward us. We're breaking for lunch, he called. You coming? Tom didn't look up right away. His eyes were still on the thermometer, one hand resting lightly against Ruth's side, steady as ever. Soon, he answered. Then, as if remembering, he glanced toward Father. Oh, John. Father paused in the doorway. Mary Ellen says she'll be staying the night with Ralph. There was no surprise in Father's face. She'll do the operation in the morning. Father gave a small nod like he'd already worked that out for himself. Yeah, he said simply. I figured. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, arms folding loosely. Being a nurse and not a doctor, he added with a faint smile, she's always been about patient care first. There was a quiet respect in the way he said it. Tom nodded back. She's thorough. That's what matters. A moment passed, easy and unhurried. Then Father straightened and clapped his hands together lightly. Well, he said, shifting the mood, I'm going to try my hand at a salad. Emily raised an eyebrow at that. This I've got to see. Father ignored her. There's cold chicken and bread in the icebox, he continued. Fresh enough. You boys coming? Tom finally glanced away from the pot, checking the thermometer again before answering. After this, John, he said with a small smile. Megan let out a soft laugh. And after you thoroughly wash up. Tom gave her a sideways look. Now what's that supposed to mean? She turned to me, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel like a secret. Ever smell the inside of a cow? I hesitated. Can't say that I have. She grinned. It stays on you for weeks. She nodded toward Tom's long glove. That's why the glove. Tom snorted. I'll clean up, he assured, shaking his head. Properly. That's what you said last time, Megan shot back. That was different. How? Tom opened his mouth, then paused. It just was. That earned a small laugh from all of us. Father shook his head, smiling. Well, don't take too long, he said. Food won't wait forever. Emily had already turned, heading back toward the house. "Come on, Dad," she called, "before you ruin that salad." Father gave us one last look. "We'll leave you to it." Then he stepped out into the daylight, Mark following close behind. George lingered for only a moment. He looked from Tom to the cows to the open door. Then, deciding where his priorities lay, he trotted off after the others without a second thought. The barn grew quieter again as the door swung shut, just the four of us now. Tom, Megan, the cows, and me. The thermometer bobbed slightly in the warming water. Tom leaned in, studying it carefully. "Almost," he said. Megan adjusted her grip on the rubber duck, ready now. Outside, faintly, we could hear voices drifting from the house, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of life continuing. Inside the barn, we waited at the edge of something small and important. By the time Megan and I made it back to the house, the smell of food had already filled every corner of it. Warm bread, cold chicken, fresh-cut greens. It hit you the moment you stepped inside, clean and honest and comforting in a way that made your shoulders drop without you even noticing. We came in just as Father was setting the last bowl on the table. "Cows are done," Megan announced, like she was reporting the completion of some grand operation. She didn't wait for a response, just grabbed a plate and dropped into her seat. "Daddy's cleaning up outside." Father nodded once. "Good." Then he gestured to the table. Salad, sliced chicken, and one of my wife's homemade loaves, there on the edge of the stove. The bread sat wrapped in a tea towel, still holding warmth. "Help yourselves." No one needed telling twice. Chairs scraped, plates filled, hands reached. Mark had already built himself a sandwich before I even sat down, stacking thick slices of chicken between two generous pieces of bread. "I'll tell you what," he said between bites, "you folks are going to like that forge." He pointed his sandwich slightly for emphasis. "Got the frame set proper, lined it with brick. Emily here helped me keep everything square." Emily gave a small shrug, though there was a hint of pride behind it. "Someone had to make sure you didn't build it crooked." Mark smirked. "I put the bellows on the floor," he went on, "rigged a spring into them so one person can run it with their foot while they work." He nodded, clearly pleased with himself. Efficient. Father leaned back slightly, chewing thoughtfully. "That'll make a difference." Mark wasn't finished. "Cement won't be dry till late tomorrow," he added, "so don't touch anything for a day or two unless you want to ruin it." "We'll leave it be," Father said. Just then the door opened again. Tom stepped in. He smelled like strong soap and something else that no amount of scrubbing had quite managed to erase. He held up the cooler in one hand. "You said you've got an ice box, John," he said. "Here's the rest of the dry ice." He gave it a small shake. "Use gloves." Father stood and took it from him carefully. "I know," he said calmly. "Handled dry ice before, back on the ISS in my youth." There was a pause. Mark stopped mid-bite. Tom froze halfway to his chair. "The International Space Station?" Mark asked, blinking. Father nodded casually like he'd just mentioned fixing a fence. "Yup." Tom let out a low whistle as he sat down and started loading his plate. "Well now," he said, glancing up, "so you're that John Walton?" Father gave a modest shrug, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "Depends who's asking." That was all it took. The rest of the meal turned into story time. I'd heard most of them before, more times than I could count. Whenever we had guests, Father had a way of circling back to those years. His time as a NASA botanist, growing food in orbit, figuring out how life could survive in places it wasn't meant to. Usually I didn't mind. Sometimes I even liked it. But today he told a new one. "I'll tell you something about being in space no one ever mentions," he said, leaning forward slightly. Mark and Tom listened like schoolboys. "Aside from the nausea, which is bad enough, you taste everything." He tapped the table for emphasis. "The air's recycled, over and over." He glanced around at us. Feet, metal, food, even things you'd rather not think about. Emily made a face. "You brush your teeth 4 or 5 times a day just to feel human again." He smiled faintly. "Napper used to suck on Hall's candies all day." Tom chuckled. "And you'd taste that too," Father added. That got a laugh around the table. Emily pushed her chair back slightly. "Well," she said, standing, "I'm finished eating. Thanks, Dad." She carried her plate toward the sink, pausing just long enough to glance at Tom. "How'd it go with the cows?" Tom wiped his mouth and leaned back. "I won't know if it took till tomorrow," he said, "but I used 2 straws on each and everything went smooth." He nodded once. "I'm hopeful." That was enough. A small cheer went up around the table, nothing loud, just a shared moment of quiet optimism. Life continuing, growing, trying again. Tom stood and stretched slightly. "Well," he said, "if we're all done here, Mark, Megan, we should get back." He picked up his plate and carried it to the sink. "Thank you for lunch, John. Delicious." He gave a small grin, and the stories weren't bad either. Megan didn't move. She stayed seated, looking at her father. "I'd like to stay," she said. Tom paused. "Daddy, please, one more night in a real bed." There was something softer in her voice now, something less playful. "You've got chores," Tom replied automatically. "I know," she said quickly, "and I'll do them, first thing tomorrow." She leaned forward slightly. "Besides, I have to check on those eggs for you." She gestured toward the direction of the coop. "And turn them." Tom hesitated, just for a second, then he smiled and shook his head. "It's up to the Waltons," he said, looking at father. "If they're willing to put up with you another night, it's fine by me." All eyes turned to father. He didn't even look up from his plate right away, just took another bite of salad, chewed thoughtfully, then nodded. "Welcome, Megan," he said around a mouthful. That was that. Megan smiled, and just like that, she was staying.